Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest movie discussion video. And today's movie that we'll be discussing is Heat, directed by Michael Mann, that was released in 1995. So I'm happy to say that I'm joined by Mike and Max once again. Happy to have you guys on the show here today.
Thank you for having us, Sonny. Happy to be here. As always, we're together. Shout out representing Medford, Massachusetts over here on the States. So, yeah, excited to get into it.
Glad to be back, Sonny. Really appreciate you having us on as always. Looking forward to the discussion to come.
Awesome. Yeah, love having you guys on the show as always, and definitely looking forward to this geek-filled chat. So just to give a quick introduction to ourselves, so I'll start things off. So my YouTube channel, Hollywood Town, is movie focused. So I primarily do movie reviews, but I also do analysis videos from time to time, and also discussion videos like the one we're doing today. So if you guys want to follow me on social media, you can do so on Instagram. That's hollywood.town. And Twitter, it's @town_Hollywood. So I'll pass it over to you, Mike, if you don't mind introducing yourself to the folks watching, and any social media plugs that you want to throw out, yeah, you're more than welcome to.
I'm Mike Reistetter. You can follow me at Reistetter23, REIS, Cheddar23, one word, on Twitter. And you can also follow Mike Reistetter on Screen Rant, both on Twitter and Screen Rant. You'll find everything movies, everything pop culture that I talk about on a constant basis.
Yeah, we both do a bit of writing over at Screen Rant. I don't do it quite as much anymore, but still do a lot of complaining and stuff on Twitter. So you can follow me there at Cinemaximilian or on Instagram at Tenenbaum Max. So yeah, nothing big to promote right now. We may, put out a video of ice cream being made later or something like that. Stay tuned. Keep your eyes, on peeled there.
Awesome. So just to give you guys a breakdown of the video, so how it normally works on the show, we go through a series of topics around the movie. So today we'll go through several topics. The first one will be the acting and characters. We'll then focus on the story. That'll then be followed by the direction. We'll then look at the action element of the movie. And then the final aspect we'll go through is any negatives that we may have had with Heat. And we'll also go through our overall thoughts. So just a quick summation of the movie before we rate the movie on a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 being if we don't really like the movie at all, and 10 being a classical masterpiece, in our opinion.
No. Yeah, you know what you were doing. Sorry, we have a dog in the room, everybody.
That's all cool.
It's going to be a wacky show.
It's all good. The madness is all right. We love improv on the show. Right. So just to kick things off in terms of the plot summary, so Heat follows, it's essentially a story about cops and robbers. So it follows Vincent Hanna, played by Al Pacino. He's a homicide cop who's chasing criminal Neil McCauley, played by Robert De Niro. And the reason why he's chasing him is because a heist at the beginning of the story goes wrong. And that essentially sets in motion the reason why Vincent chases down Neil. So just to give you guys a heads up, this is a spoiler warning for Heat. So if you haven't seen the movie, save this video, watch the movie whenever you get a chance, and then, yeah, come back to the video. So kicking things off in terms of the acting and characters section of the video. So I'll kick things off in terms of my thoughts. So in terms of, one of the reasons why I love Heat so much is the powerhouse acting on display. And kicking things off in terms of Al Pacino, he's one of the reasons why this movie works so well. With Vincent Hansen, we're getting tongue twisted there. Vincent Hanna's character, he's such an interesting character because you really feel for him. Throughout the film, we find out that he's a weary character. There's a lot of dread and uncertainty that comes with his job, and that's one of the reasons why you connect with him is because he's unable to live a normal life outside of his job. And we find this out through the conversations that he has with his estranged wife, as well as his stepdaughter. So that's one of the reasons why Vincent Hanna as a character works so well, is because he's not just your average cop, as it were, but you're able to connect to them on a human level, so that when he does chase down Neil throughout the movie, you're on his side essentially. And Pacino, apart from the bravado aspects of his performance, she's got a great ass, and there's classic memeable. I think it's essentially memeable now, his performance in a lot of ways in terms of those loud aspects.
I mean, we were definitely, before we came on today, talking about oh man, how many times are we just gonna scream out Pacino quotes in this episode?
Yeah, try to resist. We'll try.
It's so tempting.
We're getting money something as well.
Yeah, but as I was saying before, the more quieter, dramatic aspects of his characters, why in my opinion, Vincent works so well. So yeah, that's just some of the few reasons why I really like the character of Vincent Hanna as well as Al Pacino's performance. So I'll pass it over to you, Mike, just to kick things off in terms of your thoughts on Pacino's performance and maybe some of the reasons you liked the character of Hanna, or maybe you didn't for that matter.
No, yeah. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for passing over. It for sure is my favorite performance in the movie. Hitch myself to the the front runner in this case, but well-deserved praise that he gets. I often talk about when I'm talking about Pacino, which era of Pacino that me and my buddies like the most. I always go to 90s Pacino, and he is quintessential 90s Pacino. Like you mentioned, the bravado is there. It's unquestionable. He gets haywire times. He screams. He unloads. But there's also just an interesting pathos of, when everyone else is not around and you see that vulnerability, that despair, that, that longing for something else. And I find the story fascinating itself in regards to how, the characters' arcs unfold, because what you have is it's Pacino's playing Vincent Hanna, and he is a detective who everyone that knows him or is in his circle, or is as close as you can get to someone like that as you can, everyone knows that he's obsessed with his job, and there's no way around it. But I think what this movie is, it's showing what it's like when a guy's really, for the first time, being open about it, not just agreeing with everyone, but fully having those conversations that you rather avoid in passing because you don't want to, invite confrontation and invite the downfall that's to come. And that's what this movie is. It's the environment that gives, and the platform that gives these characters the ability to kind of admit what's inside them. And I just find, like with the iconic, we're sure we'll talk about it a bunch, the coffee scene with De Niro. Within 5 minutes of meeting him, he's confiding in De Niro, like, this is all I know how to do. Like, they are two men, and I guess I'll let Max take over for De Niro, since I'm so focused on Pacino here. De Niro's excellent too, of course, obviously, but it's two men that they share the common ground in that they're both only capable of being in love with their next score. For De Niro, it is the literal next score, and for Pacino, it's catching the men that seek scores. So it's De Niro. That's the only thing he knows he can pursue with all his cards, instead of, being reserved, or how he is in his, however many marriages it was. I think it was his third marriage is with his current wife within the narrative. Anyway,
it's definitely, I mean, it's a very character-driven movie, and like we'll get into this when we talk story and plot a little bit. But like when you just kind of go over the broad brushstrokes of like, this is what it's about. It's a cop. He's chasing these robbers. Like, that's something groundbreaking. We've seen that movie plenty of times. What really separates this is the characters in it, and there's a lot of little intricacies along the way that are very different, that are very original. It's because these characters are so good. When you have great characters, they kind of walk around just crapping out plot. If you've made your characters well enough. So they do that in that movie. In a character-driven movie, all the acting has to be good, and all the acting is really good. The whole cast is good. Val Kilmer, John Voight, Ted Levine.
I think
I think
yeah. Dennis Haysbert.
Yeah,
that's where all
everyone's
stands.
everyone's really good in this, and De Niro and Pacino, obviously everything centers around them and the relationship between their characters. Who we kind of touched on this when we talked about Collateral with another Michael Mann, but that relationship of Jamie Foxx and Tom Cruise kind of like is the relationship between a writer or a storyteller and the story they're telling. I can make that argument about these two characters too, that Pacino and De Niro are kind of, it mirrors the relationship of a story and a storyteller.
For sure.
And
Pacino,
they do a great job of
the movie,
setting up domino and telling you everything you know about these characters to know. It gives you the rules of this movie. And when rules are broken, there are consequences to it. And so looking back, nothing that's ever done is really a surprise, given everything we know and we've been well communicated about these characters. So, and all the acting's really good in it, but Pacino, absolutely the star and the standout of this one.
No, yeah. And just one thought on Pacino that I had forgot to mention. Yeah, I feel like it's necessary to mention. It seems like at this point in his career, he was looking for, it seems like a clip show of all his best characters and moods. Like, I see Sonny from Dog Day Afternoon and his flushed face and draining eyes. I see Corleone when he's literally chasing down the guy that ends up playing the younger version of his father in the whole third act culmination of the movie. Just a lot of, it seems like a send off to the career of Pacino, and thank God we got 25 more years and counting of him after that. But if it's
he could have ended it on that role.
No, yeah, literally, he could have retired.
Career.
Thank God it didn't. But yeah, it's just the Al Pacino variety 3-hour extravaganza.
So going on to Robert De Niro's performance as Neil McCauley, in my notes I mentioned that he's a great counterbalance to Al Pacino's performance. Al Pacino is very loud, as I mentioned before, the bravado aspects of that character, and De Niro wisely goes in the opposite direction. He's very calm, very calculated, and it's very much in keeping with his character of Neil. He goes from heist to heist. He plans out those particular missions with his crew, so it's only natural that he'd be cold, calculated, and that only goes in keeping with his character. But it's interesting with the Neil character because unlike Vincent, where he has despite the fact that he has a broken family, he has a family essentially, whereas Neil has no family. He's only got his crew, and that's what keeps him motivated, day to day. And it's not until he meets the woman in the film, played by Amy Brenneman, that he starts to develop Edie. That's the one, yeah, Edie. He meets Edie in the film, that he develops a connection with the first person in his life, essentially. We get hints of his backstory, that he had a troubled upbringing with his family, and he's essentially been a loner for most of his life. So when he does eventually meet this woman, the human element of his character opens up, and I think that's smart writing on Michael Mann, that he's able to allow the human aspects of Neil to open up when he finally meets this woman. And as I said, overall, De Niro does a really good job on the role, not only in terms of the dramatic aspects of the character, but also the action, which we'll get to later. But yeah, that's just a summary of my thoughts on De Niro's performance. Really good. Not as good as Pacino's, but nonetheless, it's a stellar performance from an absolute acting legend in De Niro. So I'll pass it over to you, Max, just to give us your thoughts on De Niro's performance as Neil McCauley and what you took away from the character as well.
Yeah, you put it really well that, Pacino is the more like animated, kind of memorable, quotable character from this. And so De Niro kind of has to be the way his character is. Otherwise, it's just two idiots screaming at each other for 3 hours.
I'd watch that.
I know you would, but I don't think everyone else would. So yeah, he does a great job of keeping it muted, keeping his cool in these incredibly high tense situations. It's really impressive given just the roles we've seen De Niro play. You're kind of like waiting for him to burst out in any moment in like emotion and rage and passion. Especially because I think like this is like 4 years after Cape Fear comes out.
I think Cape Fear was 93.
When he plays like an absolutely terrifying villain at
91.
So
yeah, 4 years.
Really does a good job of showing De Niro's range. I mean, I talked about him a little bit already in the when I was talking about his performance with Pacino before, but yeah, just because it may not be quite as memorable or quotable, and actually, I mean, like maybe the biggest quote from the movie
is De Niro,
which explains the title of the movie, does come from him. So, but yeah, he does really kind of what this performance and character demanded of him to do, and does a great job of showing his range. Given kind of like Robin Williams a little in The Birdcage, where like this is so like it's a movie about like these drag queens, and Robin Williams is playing like kind of the straight man of the two of them, and you can just kind of see what effort that is, and how badly they want to like break out, and to be able to keep a hold on it, to keep control on it, on that is really impressive from an acting standpoint.
Awesome.
Yeah, and on my De Niro thoughts, all I'd offer in addition, because I agree with both of you on several points here. I disagree with you though, Sonny, in that obviously it's first of kind of a romantic, like, or at least an effort. If it wasn't an entire human connection, at least he was putting in the effort. But I think it's established with Neil McCauley earlier that he has the capacity for human connection in regards to his relationship with Val Kilmer's Chris. That he won't let Val Kilmer know it, but he is trying behind the scenes while Val Kilmer's not looking, like, to get his wife to give him another chance, to not leave him, to make sure that after Neil McCauley, his escape route unfolds that he leaves behind a version of Chris that won't self-destruct. And you could tell that that's part of his wrestling internally with, his whole calculated way of how he approaches life can all fall apart like dominoes if Chris isn't being the version of Chris that he expects him to be. So you could tell there's that big brother, little brother dynamic between them, and that probably prepares him for what it's like to attempt to go into another human connection. This one of the romantic variety, but also definitely intimate love, like something that he has alienated his whole life in order to succeed at this one thing that he's doing. But ironically, the second he starts to involve other parts of, the human struggle, that's when things start crumbling downward for him. And the dichotomy between De Niro and Pacino, sure, it pretty well, Sonny. I think Max does too, that Christopher Nolan took a lot of influence from Heat, crafting Dark Knight between Batman and Joker, but it would be like, in my mind, it's like an unhinged Batman and a restrained Joker. If you look at Pacino as Batman and De Niro and Joker, them sitting across from each other in that interrogation scene in Dark Knight, juxtapose that with the coffee scene. I don't know. It's pretty cool. It's a nice double feature here.
So moving on to the next section, we'll be looking at the story. So I don't have much to say in terms of the story, other than the main takeaway I had from it was the suspense and tension that comes from the civilians not making it out alive in the high scenes. One of the takeaways I had from the movie, watching it for the first time, was that normally in these cop and robber movies, it's the endangering aspect is whether the criminal will make it out alive, and that's normally the suspenseful aspect, I suppose, of the story. But Michael Mann sort of subverts that expectation and essentially tells us that the civilians really are the people that are in danger, not necessarily the criminals, because it's established very early on that Neil and his crew they're at the top of their game. The odds of them being tracked down by the police, well, certainly for probably 2/3 maybe, are slim to none, essentially. So that when we get to the big heist sequence, which I'll talk in more detail later, the civilians that get killed and that are endangered constantly throughout that scene, as well as the other heist scenes as well, it's really interesting how Michael Mann focuses on specific shots where you see civilians shot or injured or killed that you don't normally see in this genre piece, as it were. So that's one of the big takeaways I had from the story, was the suspense element, specifically how civilians are constantly endangered, and you don't normally get that in the genre piece, as I said before. So Max, I'll pass it over to you now, just to give us your thoughts on the story. And did you get a similar experience to myself in terms of that element of the story, or did you have a different experience?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I hadn't thought about like all the focus on the civilians that we get until you kind of pointed it out. I will say like the story, from the opening kind of lets you know like what type of story this is going to be. And that happens in when the first robbery kind of starts to go wrong and they wind up killing like 3 people they didn't want to have to kill. But you learn early on, like these people will not hesitate to kill someone if they think it is in their best interest. They won't hesitate to do it. And so that definitely sets the stage early. And what's crazy about that is there's kind of this mass subversion here where by the end of it, you're rooting part of you, like you've seen Robert De Niro and his crew do all these crazy things, and like you kind of still want De Niro to get away with it somehow. Like you don't really want him to get killed or Pacino to catch him. You kind of want both guys to win in a weird way, Pacino and De Niro. But so I don't know. It's cool how he can kind of trick the audience into doing something like that. I think this is an in Collateral. I think Mann kind of suffered from like dumb police syndrome or convenient police syndrome. I like it way more in Heat. I feel like it's way more like realistically portrayed, and I think it makes for a cooler, better, more tense story for sure.
Yeah,
I think in regards to story too, what's fascinating about this movie is you acknowledge that in a Hollywood system, obviously a movie like this is going to appeal to cinephiles, like big movie fans, as essentially what a boy looked down to a long event film type. But these days, this movie would be made into a superhero movie. But back then, like this movie is going to check off all those boxes. But at the same time, you have to recognize a lot of times in the actual selling of a movie, both when you're trying to get it made and when you're trying to get it to appeal to audiences, sometimes you just got to latch on to a high concept. Just a single blunt line of like what we're going to market this as. I don't even know if you guys know this, but we checked out a trailer yesterday and of it. And
how would you know that?
No, well, you know a little bit of it, but I was reading extensively about the marketing of the movie, and this movie was marketed to Johnny American, like anyone's watched the movie as Michael Corleone,
mass blockbuster.
Michael Corleone versus Vito Corleone, the team up element of De Niro and Pacino, who are both very beloved actors, still are. This was their first movie where they were sharing screen time. They let audiences before the movie came out know that they are going to be on the same screen at some time, and the movie was all about pitting them against each other. And so, like expanding on what I was saying earlier, like even if you were unsure of certain plot elements at some point, you're still captivated by the fact that this is essentially, whether you view it as like a sports movie with the football coaches being Pacino and De Niro, like, or a war movie where, like the commanders of each side of the war battalions in the battlefield, or De Niro and Pacino, like any way you want to spin it, it makes it compelling for both the people that are very into analyzing film or the people that just like to see a quality movie and escape. And this movie, it reminds you of like that time when, obviously as a moviegoer now, I'm always so actively like breaking it down while I'm watching it. But this movie reminds me of being 10 years old and being shown like a tremendous movie by dad or uncle or something, and like forget it and like checking, myself at the door. So yeah, I found this an interesting movie that culminates in the De Niro Pacino like chasing each other at the airport runway and everything. And that just comes to mind that sometimes the simple high concept pitch of a story, like what if Michael and Vito Corleone could just like chase each other, that worked for me.
So the next topic that we'll be talking about is the direction of the movie. The direction, in my opinion, is one of the strongest aspects of Heat. And I know countless critics and audiences have mentioned this, but Michael Mann directs LA like no other director. The way he captures the city in terms of the size and the scale is nothing like anything you've ever seen on film. And that really adds to the story and the characters that we experience in this movie. You really get the sense of the size and the scale of the job at hand for Vincent in trying to track down Neil. And it's interesting because LA really is a character in this movie. All the locations that we go throughout the movie, whether it's a steel mill or a nightclub or downtown LA, where we see the famous bank heist scene, Michael Mann allows us to really experience these locations and get a feel for what the city is like, both in the day and more specifically at nighttime. Because I know many people know Michael Mann loves shooting at nighttime, and he really captures the almost dreamlike aspect of LA. So that's one of the big takeaways for me in this movie is how Michael Mann captures the character of LA, and how it really feeds into both the story and the characters as well. So I'll pass it over to you, Max, just to give us your thoughts on the character of LA and how it feeds into the story. And did you get a similar impression to myself in terms of how it feeds into the direction of the movie, or did you feel it was sort of in the background? It doesn't really, serve a purpose to the story and the characters.
No, I mean it's hard to you'll be hard pressed to watch a Michael Mann movie and not feel like, oh wow, like LA's a character in this movie. LA's so big and it's so spread out and there's still so much happening, and that's kind of the way Michael Mann directs. That's kind of his greatest strength, is he can put you in like this enormous vast space and have all these little things going on in this big space, and he does it in a way and shows it to you and gives you that information in a way that you can keep track of all of it and you understand what's going on, which is like just really hard to do. And he does a great job of it. He has awesome just kind of spatial awareness. Like we've kind of already touched on, it's almost a 3-hour movie that's paced so well, and it doesn't feel that way at all. And you'll be really, really hard pressed, I think, to find big action movies kind of in this genre since Heat came out, that like don't seem to be influenced by Heat, or that don't kind of remind you a little bit of Heat. And that, more than anything for me, is like such a signifier of a director that's done like an incredible, when everyone else kind of starts to like do lookalike impressions of that director afterwards, like, yeah, they knocked it out of the park. And Michael Mann definitely does that. and I think it's probably his most well directed movie. I mean, this is his masterpiece for sure.
Two things from me on the directing that Michael Mann brings to the table here. One, I can't remember who exactly said. I'm sure many people have said it, but they say, a filmmaker or storyteller is essentially telling the same story throughout his career, but just in different ways. Take the same basic what you're bringing into it, and then X, Y, and Z happens instead of that. So in a compliment piece to I look earlier in the career of Michael Mann with Thief, James Caan, and other things like Manhunter, the first Hannibal Lecter movie, a little scene, very good. These are movies that were dominated by a single lead. I haven't seen Last of the Mohicans, which was before Heat, but if the poster's any indication, Daniel Day-Lewis was the clear-cut lead of that movie, and then there were all the supporting players, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll see when I eventually do that. Anyway, Michael Mann is a director of, powerhouse A-list actors and character study type of thing. It was almost like Heat feels like his way to say, I'm here and I'm going to top myself. Everyone thinks they know what they're expecting with a Michael Mann movie. As we're talking about, there's so many things that happen throughout all of his movies, and I feel like Heat was the definer. Like, moving forward, don't be so sure of yourself before I come in, because we talk about this, his directing approach to the famous bank robbing scene. What does this say about it? It kind of counteracts everything we say about Michael Mann as a director of LA. When we think of that, we think of LA nightlife and all the night of Collateral that was to come later. Thief and Manhunter are movies that take place a lot at night as well, but that the big bank robbing heist it was described in a review I read, which I love this juxtaposition of words. It was called a daytime cityscape. Yeah, like in the middle of broad daylight. It harkens back to when they would do the actual bank heists in the 20s and 30s, which Michael Mann would eventually go on to do in Public Enemies as well. I don't know. I just really like that he swung for the fences there, and it crushed. It's a big, you see that in all the superhero movies now, all the daytime action, the destruction of civilian life and pedestrians in the city, and just rocking a whole entire like metropolis like city area. I feel like that begins with Heat. It really, really left an impression. And now on the director of Michael Mann of actors, I know this is a common practice in the theater world, but my mind goes to, I'm a fan of a director, Danny Boyle. He did a filmed adaptation of Frankenstein, and this Frankenstein I watched. It was really good. Johnny Lee Miller and Benedict Cumberbatch, they took turns every night playing Frankenstein and playing Frankenstein's Dr. Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. I feel like the directing in Heat, I don't know, my mind reminds me, this seems like a throwback to plays that Michael Mann could have had an opportunity to do a play of this without all the action, granted, but it just, the relationship between the acting, I feel like this was his best directing of actors, with the dialogue, even if there was no action in the movie, you would still feel all the tension. And if you switch on and off, you could even play, if say you did you really went for and did the Heat play, you could have De Niro playing Hannah one night, Pacino playing Macaulay, and vice versa. That would be an interesting exercise. Obviously, it won't happen these days because they're like 80, but hey, they were playing 40-year-olds in The Irishman a couple of years ago.
True.
Anyway, yeah, sorry to go off on that tangent, but it just, he was the only Michael Mann movie, as as a director of action. Obviously, there's a lot of action set pieces here. I really felt him doing his best work in terms of characters, and obviously he would go on to do that Collateral, comes 10 years later. That's a great one with Cruise and Jamie Foxx, great relationship there. Miami Vice, Colin Farrell, and Jamie Foxx, Electric. There's always, I feel like he was the beginning of, he's like, I'm
his bromance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's the first in that
Frenemies.
series. Yeah.
Another aspect of the direction that I wanted to talk about was the slow, methodical pace that Michael Mann deploys. With the long runtime at essentially nearly 3 hours, it allows Michael Mann to look into the psychological profiles of both Vincent and Neil. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that's one of the reasons why we connect with these characters, is because we will learn about their pasts, well, somewhat anyway, with both Vincent and Neil. We learn what makes them tick, what they hate, what they like, and more specifically, why they love their professions. And I'm very much looking forward to talking about this because I know everyone's talked about the diner scene. It's been talked about to the nth degree, but I feel any discussion about Heat without mentioning that iconic diner scene, it's kind of as much of a crime as the one that Neil and his crew commits in the movie.
Sorry for cutting you off. So you ever go to a movie and middle of the movie, you're like, okay, middle of the movie, let me go to the bathroom. Imagine people that when they saw the movie, they went to the bathroom during the diner scene. I'm sure there's some people that missed it.
I can't imagine the horror of coming back to find out it was one of the greatest scenes in my opinion in movies.
I love when that happens in the middle of the movie. I think I was telling you before we started that I was shown that scene as a kid by my uncle, and when I finally saw the movie years later, I always assumed that was going to be at the end of the movie. That the movie was building to that.
No, structurally it just works so well as that like
makes much more sense.
Midpoint, like whoa, you didn't think the scene was going to happen, and here we are.
Stealing that so much, it's like the lead characters in the movie just. The camera stopped rolling, and they're like, "All right, let's go get coffee." It seems very meta. Like
there's something about that. So with Quentin Tarantino's movies, he seems to have this pattern in all of his scenes of like talking. Some crazy action thing happens at the end of the scene. That's like every Quentin Tarantino scene. In this movie, it's not that every scene is like that. It's that it feels like every scene could be like that. It feels like every single scene is just like this ticking time bomb where you're like, I don't know what's going to happen at the end of the scene, but like some irreversible decision will be made at the end of the scene. You can just kind of feel it. And the biggest scene, this coffee shop scene, seems like the one exception to that. For some reason, when these two guys go to sit down, like maybe I'm alone in this, but when I was watching it, I was like, they're like, no one's going to kill each other right now. Like this is like, it's the eye of the hurricane of the movie, and you're in it when you're in it too, and you're like, okay, nothing like crazy is gonna happen in this scene. They're just giving us like a breather and giving us some awesome dialogue to hear while we do it, and then we're probably gonna pick right back up and things are gonna be crazy again, and it is, and that's what I love. Right after this scene is when Pacino gets back, and they're like, oh yeah, Robert De Niro just did X, Y, Z. He just lost all our tails and cut all of our like bugs that we planted, and Pacino is so pissed, and that's so fun. He's heartbroken. He's like, I thought we were friends. Like I just talked to him. Like I can't believe he would stab me in the back. Like he's in love with him, and it's fun to watch.
That coffee scene was halftime. That was halftime in the big football championship, and during halftime, the two coaches go and smoke cigars underneath the bleachers.
Like, hey, hell of a game.
They're like, man, thank God no one knows that we're friends. Otherwise, this would corrupt the entire.
Really unique.
And what's noteworthy too, everything that you're shown, what is not shown, I always wonder, and no one really talks about it. I'm surprised I didn't find it on Reddit, who paid the bill. I mean, Pacino said, I'm going to buy coffee, but maybe De Niro put some money. And instead, the ending, like, no, I pay. Like,
no, I think De Niro can't pay because he's probably leaving evidence behind if he pays.
Right. Sorry. in my ripoff, Angel Face.
But Pacino can't write that off. He can't write that off as a deduction. But
right.
Awesome points, guys, with regards to the direction of the movie, and more specifically the diner scene. I think we're all in agreement of just the iconic and brilliant nature of that scene. And in terms of just a few more points that I had on that diner scene, you really find out the psychological profiles of both Vincent and Neil, and why they love their jobs. And we mentioned earlier, the bromance between these characters. They're two sides of the same coin essentially, and you can tell Vincent really doesn't want to kill Neil. He kind of says to him, if you just stop what you're doing, and you might have a chance of seeing another day. But Neil tells him, I'm like you. I love my job. I'm not gonna stop at anything. The famous line from De Niro. If you can't stand the heat from around the corner, I can't paraphrase it or quote it directly because it's so intricate, that line of dialogue. But you guys know what I'm talking about. The famous
like never have anything in your life that you can't leave in 30 seconds if you feel the heat coming around the corner, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a really interesting scene because it works on a plot level somewhat, but really it's getting to know them. And finding out why we love these characters so much. So it really is one of the great scenes in in cinema history, if I dare say. Really well written, and it's interesting just from a technical point of view. Before we go on to the action, that from my understanding, I don't know if Mike can verify this or not. That I don't think Michael Mann shot profile. A wide shot between De Niro and Pacino. I think it was all coverage behind, but over the shoulder for De Niro and Pacino.
Which I really love because it's kind of showing you like these two characters cannot exist in the same space. They are destined to compete for the same space throughout their stories,
and only seen from each other's more or less point of view. Never given us the chance to look at them together. Yeah, exactly. Same point.
Yep.
Same shot. Yeah. It's either one or the other. The yin and the yang.
But yeah, awesome points on the dynasty, and like I said, no discussion of Heat is complete without mentioning that iconic scene between De Niro and Pacino. So moving on to the final topic of this Heat discussion will be the action element. Now it's interesting because much like Collateral, Michael Mann's later movie, though it's marketed as like in this case, it's a crime drama action film, and then obviously with Collateral, it's more of an action thriller. In the case of both films, there's not really a lot of action when you really think about it. There's one or two big set pieces, but it's funny, the studios really they kind of market it as like these quasi crime action flicks when really they're character movies in the case of both flicks. But in the case of Heat, I really want to talk about the iconic downtown shootout sequence that takes place after the bank robbery. For me, and I always talk about this whenever I get the chance to on my movie channel on YouTube, that geography and knowing what the hell is going on is so important in action. I'm sure you guys can agree with me. I think modern blockbusters and modern action films nowadays, they're keen to cut quickly between the characters and not give you a sense of where the characters are and where they are in relation to each other. Whereas the downtown sequence is fantastic because you know where Vincent and his police squad are. They're positioned on either side of the street. You know where Neil and his crew are. They're coming out of the bank into the car, which they think they've succeeded, but we quickly find out that the police have surrounded the entire block, essentially, of this portion of downtown LA. And it's such an iconic sequence, not because of the bloody mess that unfolds, but because of the way it's shot. Cinematographer Dante Spinotti and Michael Mann really show us the chaos and the friction between these characters through the shootout. And there's a lot of wide shots. There are cuts in the scene, but I think Michael Mann's wise to use them for emotional reaction when we see a cop get injured or hurt. He only uses those cuts for emotional resonance, which I think directors, they tend to forget nowadays. The cuts are used for, flash. Michael Mann's the opposite. He uses it for emotional impact. So those are some of the takeaways that I had from this particular set piece. It's one of the great action scenes, not only of the 90s, but of all time, just because of how it plays out. And one of the bits of trivia that I read for this particular set piece is that Michael Mann placed microphones throughout the set to capture the blank rounds that were being fired on this location. From what I understand, most shootouts, they tend to capture those bullet sounds in post, so they'll either get stock footage or capture some real life ammo and then capture it in post and dub it over. But knowing Michael Mann as this detail oriented director, it was not surprising to learn that bit of trivia that he was keen to capture those blanks on set and have microphones placed around. So it's a really
I'm curious to see what the timeline was when filming was compared to the shooting in the movie The Crow. I don't know if you've seen The Crow.
I was literally going to say, I can imagine someone being like, Michael Mann, what about Brandon Lee? And being like, don't care.
I think The Crow came out in 94, I think, which is after filming of Heat, potentially. Or maybe there was some crossover. I don't know. Have you seen The Crow, or do you know about The Crow?
I've heard good things about it, but I've not seen it now.
Yeah, it's
a memorable watch.
Not spoiling anything of the movie, this is the real life fact that Bruce Lee's son, Brandon Lee, was killed by one of the blanks. An
on-set accident with someone thought.
Oh yeah, I'm aware of the accident.
But which is, it's funny that you mentioned The Crow period, because like The Dark Knight, another movie we mentioned, is literally it's like Heat and The Crow had a baby, and that was The Dark Knight.
It's the crafting of the Joker.
Yeah.
Yeah, that downtown action sequence is, as I was saying, one of my favorite action scenes of all time, just because of the way it's shot and the way it's put together as well. So, Mike, I'll hand it over to you now, just to give us your thoughts on the iconic downtown sequence,
I'll
and
actually
maybe some of the other heist missions that you took away in terms of
for
how
sure.
the action is framed and put together.
Yeah, I was gonna say pass it over to Max to start with the shootout because I actually went to the bathroom during that scene, so I missed it.
Ah,
I'm joking.
I'm gonna start. Or do you want to go?
No, I'll go. You said shootout, and then what other action pieces I adored?
Just any action directing.
yeah, just the action in general. I mean, you can talk about that particular scene or
John Wick movies.
No.
No, that shootout. Like I am, I did the thing where you talk about this category, or an earlier category. I was mentioning how subversive it was, that both subversive and apropos subversive, and that Michael Mann movie, you expect nighttime action, and he sets it middle of broad daylight, but it's apropos in that this is a throwback to all of the 30s gangsters movies. I just watched The Public Enemy recently, not Michael Mann's Public Enemies. The Public Enemy with James Cagney. That one was super good. Yeah, all gangster and bank robber movies from back then. They all felt like they were coming back after like years dormant in like a volcanic eruption between that shootout scene and Val Kilmer catching bullets. That's devastating. He was huge at the time, not on the level of Pacino and De Niro, but that shootout, it just it harkens back to, you could call this a war movie if you wanted, sports movie, everything. It reminds me of any type of movie that has that action. It's all culminating in that. You could call it a genre-bending mix of everything, or just broadly action, and you're enthralled. And obviously if you're watching it at home, which my first watch of Heat was at home, this big shootout is happening, and I can't help but pause and see, wow, like this movie is it's going fast. But then I pause it, and it probably says like 50 minutes left or something. Like, oh my god, like what can happen after this? Like, this seems like the big thing. Like, is there going to be more? And what ends up happening more later is my favorite sequence of the movie, which I mentioned earlier, which is De Niro and Pacino one-on-one. De Niro in the coffee scene foreshadowing, saying, if I catch you around the corner, I'll drop everything. Literally does that to Edie, breaks her heart there, he comes back from killing Waingro, and then the chase is on, and it's electric for me. And I like that they don't really say much. I know I think they say something. De Niro says something as he's dying. I like that the final shot. The music is just beautiful. It reminds me of Westerns as well, where oftentimes in Westerns you're going to have gunslingers that they have a mutual respect for each other, and they want to die by each other's hand. That's everything that's coming together when I view that final sequence. I compare it to obviously I said to The Godfather, and The Godfather 2. It's like having your dichotomous relationship between father and son there. Reminds me of Back to the Future as well, with Marty McFly getting to spend all the time with the version of his dad that was his age. That's just everything I'm thinking about in there. I'm going beyond what the text requires, but like I said, and tying it all together to my original point, this movie's marketed to anyone that needs an excuse to go to the theater. Like, want to see Michael versus Vito? Here's your chance. And I love talking to that to anyone that'll hear it, that thinking of if that's going on in anyone else's mind, like kind of, the overwhelming experience for whether, we get a Vincent Hanna backstory and
action directing. Keep it on action directing.
Yeah, right. I mean, the directing of the scene's awesome. Period. I'll end there.
I actually don't have too much to add about the action directing that we kind of haven't already said at some point on this episode already. Like I said, I think Mann's biggest strength as a director is his ability to allow you to keep track of all these little things happening in a huge space. Val Kilmer's looked really cool in a lot of movies, Tombstone and Top Gun and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and he by far has never looked cooler, and even Top Secret, but he's never looked cooler than the the robbery scene, the scene we're talking about in this movie. That's his all time like coolest he's ever looked, I think. So that in and of itself is enjoyable.
I thought the same thing
be acknowledged.
I thought the same thing with De Niro. I thought he never looked cool with it.
But I'm glad you mentioned the war movies thing too, because this scene feels like something from a war movie.
That's how
like two armies fighting each other.
That's where the directing comes in. Yeah, and you have the power to rewatch a movie. So like I said, you can watch this movie. Depending on what crowd you're with, you could watch this as a sports movie. You could watch it as a war movie. You could watch it as a western. You could watch it as a stage play.
It's everything. Musical.
Just fast forward through all the action. Who would do that? But
we'll try. We'll see what we like it.
Some of the standout scenes of this movie, obviously, the testament to great directing, has no action at all. But all the tension is bubbling to the surface so much that, like I said, volcanic eruption.
So going on to the final aspect of this video, we're looking at the negatives of the movie. So in terms of this particular movie, Heat, I'd probably say more nitpicks than negatives. Going back to the length of the movie, because it's nearly 3 hours, there are a couple of subplots that don't always get resolved, or when they do, they don't really add much to the the overarching narrative. The ones that stand out to me are the one with the Vincent stepdaughter, played by Natalie Portman, and then Danny Trejo's character, and Wayne Grey, I suppose, to an extent, but he's probably more of a main character than, say, Danny Trejo's character. So it was Danny Trejo and the stepdaughter. Some of those subplots don't really feed into the wider narrative, and I think it's going back to Michael Mann's realistic and grounded tone for this movie, trying to show the human elements of these particular characters. But I didn't take a lot from those particular subplots. They didn't really add much in terms of either the plot or feeding into Vincent and Neil's character arcs. And so the other nitpick that I had with this movie was the planning for the heists in the case of Neil's character and the investigative scenes with Vincent's character. In terms of that realistic tone that Michael Mann's going for, I think it's great on the page. And I suppose even in a TV show, like, say, for example, like The Wire, where when you've got 10 seasons or something to explain a story, you've got that time to explain, the more, I wouldn't say boring, but more sort of talky scenes, as it were. But with a movie, I think you kind of have to draw the line somewhere in terms of being realistic, but not forgetting the entertaining and engaging aspect of any movie. And there were definitely times where I kind of found them a little bit dry, and it didn't really go in a lot of interesting places, those particular scenes. I appreciated what Michael Mann was going for in terms of trying to add to the realism and grounded tone of the movie. But there were a couple of moments when Neil's planning his next heist, or Vincent's talking to other police officers, that again, it doesn't really feed into the wider narrative. And again, it's Michael Mann's way of just making the film more realistic and, as I said before, grounded. So I'll pass it over to you, Max. Just any negatives that you had with Heat, if you had any similar negatives to myself, and maybe some of the things that you didn't like when you watched this movie.
Yeah, even though it's well paced, runtime is a little bit long, can maybe make it a little inaccessible at times to people. I mean, honestly, I think my biggest negative would be, and it'd probably be just kind of the lack of strong, well-rounded female characters in the movie. You've got some female characters, but they're just kind of like, wives or girlfriends to the male main characters, and just kind of these things that, especially in like the two biggest main Pacino and De Niro's characters, the women in their life are just kind of things that pull them away and distract them from doing the jobs that they want to do in their life. So it doesn't, I guess, paint like a wonderfully well-rounded, realistic shape of the women in the universe. Other than that, I mean, that's the only big negative I can think of off the top of my head.
I think for me, Michael Mann relies here in this movie specifically so much so on De Niro and Pacino with their natural, because we know them so well as an audience, they have behaviors and mannerisms that could make you laugh, and that kind of brings in the humor factor. I think if there was downtime where people felt like lows in the plot, there could have been more humor for the other characters involved that didn't just require a sense of knowing the actors themselves. I think one thing that stands out to me is just the whole movie hinges on the fact that Waingro was just a nutcase that shouldn't have been on the crew.
Mm.
De Niro is such a control freak and like you said, calculated and like
Micromanager
and a perfectionist. Like, why does he not have a like rigorous vetting process in place? Like, how did Waingro ever be allowed to be on this crew? It feels like self-saboteur move by De Niro. I mean, he was planning for an escape route, like this was going to be his last heist and then done. Maybe he thought, I don't know. I don't know. That was just one thing that stands out to me. The more I watch this movie, the more I'm like, Waingro shouldn't have been on this crew again. My favorite. We were just doing negatives, not positives, or
just negatives. Yeah.
I was going to say a negative related to my favorite quote, but it's no big deal.
But yeah, interesting to hear your negatives on the movie. I know most people that see this movie love it, and obviously, especially the performances and the direction. But that was the main one for me was just the runtime and some of those side plots that don't really add much in the the wider narrative. But yeah, interesting to hear your thoughts, guys, on the negative aspects of Heat. So just to wrap things up in terms of our overall thoughts and then rating Heat on a scale of 1 to 10. So I'll kick things off. So in terms of Heat, the big things that I love about this movie are the acting, first and foremost. So great performances from Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and obviously the supporting cast as well. They did a pretty good job as well. Meticulous attention to detail, as always, from Michael Mann. We really get a deep insight into the psychological profiles of both these characters. We really latch onto them. And that's a testament to Michael Mann taking the time and effort to develop these scenes with these characters so that you actually care for them when it comes to the climatic encounter between Vincent and Neil. And action, as I said before, there's not a lot of action, but the big one is the downtown sequence. And for me, it's one of the greatest action scenes of the 90s, as well as all time as well, just because of how it's planned out, not both figuratively within the film and within the story, and obviously in real life as well. And yeah, it's such a well drawn out scene. And I think anyone who wants to get into that space, action filmmaking, should definitely watch this scene in terms of how to frame action, how to place characters within a scene. It's a testament to Michael Mann and his production crew. So overall for me, despite a couple of redundant subplots in the movie and some of the more talky scenes with Vincent and Neil, they don't always go anywhere within the wider plot. I'm going to give Heat an 8.5 out of 10. So that's my final rating for the movie. So Max, I'll hand it over to you now just to give your overall thoughts on the movie and then rating it on a scale of 1 to 10. And then, Mike, you can do the same if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to summarize, I think this is there's a few small flaws with this, but this is Michael Mann's masterpiece. I think his objectively kind of his best movie, and just some of the best acting you'll ever see. There's not too much more I feel like I need to say that hasn't already been said. It's a 9 out of 10 for me. 9 out of 10.
Yep, my favorite is Collateral, but this is his masterpiece. This is his best movie. This is the one that I find the least amount of flaws. And the flaws are overcome by just, you're not really waiting around too long for the next, just wow scene to reveal itself. I say acting, directing, quotability, all the shooting, just, and the movie, like I said, Godfather parallels, that's an easy 9 out of 10 for me. I love when a movie reminds me of other movies that I love.
Almost every movie does that for you, I feel like.
That's
good.
You don't keep comp clowns for nothing.
So that's a wrap, guys, on this particular video today discussing Michael Mann's Heat. It was an absolute pleasure talking to yourself, Max and Mike. Loved geeking out with yourselves on this awesome movie. So if you guys want to follow us on social media, all our plugs to our relevant channels will be in the description below. So definitely check us out for all things movie related. But once again, guys, huge thank you for taking the time out of your day for being on the show here today. And as always, I look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.
Always a pleasure, Sonny. Thank you.
Of course, Sonny. Thanks for having us.
Take care.
Guys. Cool.